Another one done. So this month was Darwin's Black Box, and it was intense. It was a lot. Like I say every time, if you haven't joined, please join me in the Catholic Reads Challenge, and you can sign up below. I know it's April, but it doesn't matter. Please join me. I'd love to have you there. I'm only going to say a few things about this book because it really is dense, and I will probably reread it because it requires rereading. What is it about? It is an argument against evolution, basically a biochemical challenge to evolution. And Michael Behe, the scientist, really got into the details of everything. In the beginning, he explains the term irreducibly complex, irreducible complexity. By irreducibly complex, I mean a single system composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of the parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning. So he uses a mousetrap to illustrate that, because with a mousetrap, its function is to catch a mouse, and it cannot work. It will not work unless all the parts are there. You cannot remove a part and make it use it as a mousetrap. Yes, you can use it for other purposes, and what it is what other people have said on the other side, but in the end the function is taken away. I wish I used this function instead of purpose in one of my videos that I did about atheism. There must be an identifiable function of the system. One has to be careful, though, in defining the function. A sophisticated computer can be used as a paperweight. Is that its function? A complex automobile can be used to help dam a stream. Is that what we should consider? No. In considering design, the function of the system we must look at is the one that requires the greatest amount of the system's internal complexity. We can then judge how well the parts fit the function. The function of a system is determined from the system's internal logic. The function is not necessarily the same thing as the purpose to which the designer wished to apply the system. So I used the word purpose, but I guess function is a better word for what I should have used in that video, right? People are so relative these days, subjective, like, yeah, you can, this is a book, but it can also be a paperweight, or it can also be a hat. But no, I've explained this before. If I were to draw something, if I were to draw a chair on a piece of paper and I showed it to you, you would say it's a chair. Part 2 is when he gets into the nitty-gritty of things. What really opened up the book to me was the part about how our blood clots. These are some things that I never thought about, that I never asked myself. It's super fascinating. So when blood clots, first of all, you have to think, okay, the blood clots, that means there is something in it that clots the blood. Fibrinogen is in your system all the time, but it should not clot when it's not supposed to. Your blood can't clot when you're normal, when you don't have any cuts or anything. You can't do that, otherwise you can die. If the blood doesn't clot enough, you can also die. That can also lead to your death. So there's the amount, there's the timing, there's the material. The blood clotting system in our bodies is a cascade, and he compares it to the contraptions that you see in the cartoons. Rube Goldberg, and he's known for his contraptions. These contraptions, there's a step and a step and a step, and basically if you remove one of these steps, then it can't work. It can't complete its function. And he really does get into the details of it. So sometimes it was a little difficult for me. I really liked that he got into the great technical details of for example, the blood clotting and the cilium and the cell and things like that. But he also does kind of a recap at the end of every technical part, just because for a person like me who doesn't have a great knowledge of the technicalities of biology, it's great to have the analogies on the side, just like the Rube Goldberg cartoons that he used to demonstrate a cascade for the blood clot. And he talks and then he talks about several theories that evolutionists have brought up of how perhaps one thing became, well, the the theory of A, B, C, and D. A became B, became C, became D. The problem for Darwinian evolution is this: if only the end product of a complicated biosynthetic pathway is used in the cell, how did the pathway evolve in steps? If A, B, and C have no use other than as precursors to D, what advantage is there to an organism to make just A? Or if it makes A to B, if a cell needs AMP, what good will it do to just make intermediate 3 or 4 or 5? AMP is required for life. Either it immediately has a way to produce or obtain AMP, or the cell is dead. I also really like that he really does go through the different questions skeptics will ask or have asked, and answers that. And the great point that he brings up a lot in general is that, yes, you say you might have this theoretical answer for how something evolved, but you never say how it came to be. Those are two different things. How something came into existence is completely different from something that just changed, that already exists. And I think that is the main problem when it comes to evolution. He addresses the different claims that, people say that through the advancement of science, we have learned so much. They teach evolution as a science that is very concrete in our world today. There are many scientific publications that might mention or have a title saying that evolution, these are some evidence for evolution, but in the actual paper itself, there's nothing about it. There is no concrete evidence. Data without numbers, or data without putting a name on a certain chemical, how much of that chemical or whatever it may be is not science, because you cannot observe it. It's all just in your head. It's all just math, and a lot of the times the math doesn't even add up. Something I already knew. There are a lot of scientists out there that don't agree or don't believe in evolution, but they can't say anything. Otherwise, they will lose their jobs, they will lose their careers. Forrest Mims, he was going to write for a column, but they asked him if he believed in evolution. He said no, and they didn't hire him. So he didn't even get the job. He's also talks about a few famous experiments. People have created life. So these experiments, they already had the matter. Nothing was created. The matter was already there. They just put it in a very habitable environment so that the molecules necessary for the creation of life can flourish, and they were able to create proteins. But you still had the material from the beginning. It's like a chef, as he had explained, that there are basically, you go to the grocery store, you buy your stuff, and you expect the eggs, the milk, the butter, the sugar to all of a sudden become cake, and without your assistance. But these these chemicals are still assisted through the ideal environment, the person mixing them together. They're not creating, they hadn't created anything. He's not against microevolution. Evolution does exist, yes, but microevolution, we see that in animals. That is what Darwin observed, right, with the finches. But we have never observed, nor is it possible. Gradualism is not possible at a microbiological level, because there are systems that cannot be removed. I've talked about the flagellar motor, right? The flagellum, where it's a rotor, like on a boat. And if you take apart anything, well, it will not function. Yeah, I don't know. I want to say more, but I feel like you should just read the book and read it for yourself, because it really is, like I said, dense. And he's even said, like, he even has provided, there's a great bibliography, and there's an appendix to get into more detail, but I will definitely have to read it again, especially chapter 2. Chapter 2 is a chunk where all the technical stuff is written. I hope you enjoyed it. What did you think? Did you read this? Have you read this already? It is very, very good, and it's dense. It's the kind of book that you need to read chunks at a time, leave it for a couple days, but it's really good. So if you'd like to join me, please sign up below. I would love to have you. And so on to the next one. At certain moments in history, destiny seems to hesitate between weal and woe, as if awaiting the arrival of someone who usually doesn't come. But toward the end of the 12th century, a child appeared who almost managed to turn the Christian ideal into a triumphant fact. Was it September 1181 or early 1182? He was born sometime between those dates in Assisi, a town in Umbria, whose roots are lost in antiquity. A Christian town, to be sure, but a place where immemorial pagan traditions seemed to spring forth from the Etruscan soil. This little city in the heart of Italy followed the calendar of either Pisa or Florence. But so far the archives have told us nothing about the name chosen for a newborn whose family was not illustrious, which explains the uncertainty over his birth. Historians are still trying to locate the house where he came into the world. Various sites have been pointed to, the latest research claiming provisionally that he was born not in a stable between an ox and an ass, as some enthusiasts would have it, but in a solid, handsome residence near the Piazza del Comune. His father was away when his mother gave birth. Her name was Giovanna, but they called her Pica, no doubt because she came from Picardy. She was still confined to her bed when the man knocked on the door of the house asking for alms. At the time of birth, as at Christmas, pilgrims were never turned away. The family thought they could get rid of this one by giving him a wing from the chicken prepared for the recuperating mother. But the old man wasn't satisfied with the wing and asked to be shown the new baby. Lady Pica protested a little, but she had a stubborn customer to deal with, and when he pressed his mysterious demand, she sensed some kind of supernatural influence and finally agreed. She let him come in and even take the child in his arms. He began at once to prophesy, declaring that on that day 2 boys had been born in Assisi, one of whom would be among the best of men, while the other would be among the worst. Here I can't help thinking of those allegorical characters in Hawthorne's stories, whose veiled words become clear only long after they have been uttered. 2 boys, the best and the worst. Perhaps they were one and the same boy, the carnal and spiritual man of St. Paul. Doesn't each one of us have the makings of both a saint and a hardened sinner? Every serious Christian has experienced that cruel war between those 2 irreconcilable enemies. Back then, of course, this explanation never crossed anyone's mind. People already knew who the best one was, and they wondered who the worst could be. Years later, they found him in the shape of a wretch who had been born on the same date and had died on the gallows. In any case, after she had been churched, his mother brought him to the Cathedral of San Rufino. He had barely crossed the threshold when he entered the kingdom of legends, where he was destined to remain. He had already fallen prey to God. We don't know a great deal about Lady Pica, except that she was very pious. The name she gave her child was not a random choice. Baptismal names were indelible and left their mark on one's entire life. The water flowed down his head, and he was called Giovanni, not the evangelist, but the Baptist, the man who had plunged Jesus into the waters of the Jordan. That Giovanni had announced the coming of the Messiah and preached repentance as the way to salvation. And Jesus had said of him that he was the greatest of men. For this reason, Pica felt sure about her son's future, now that he had been put under the protection of the most honored saint of all. Pica's neighbors believed she had the gift of clairvoyance. She would readily prophesy after the fashion of the time. "You'll see that his merits will make of him a son of God," she would say some years later. So little Giovanni was brought back home in the arms of his mother, who loved him as much as she was proud of him. He was a pretty, bright-eyed boy with a tiny, slightly pale face, but he seemed sickly, and he had to be carefully nursed all through childhood. Time passed, and his father returned. Then the troubles began, troubles that proved to be never-ending. Pietro di Bernardone looked at his son. When he learned that in his absence the child had been baptized Giovanni, he flew into a violent rage. A cloth merchant by trade, he was just back from Champagne, where he had bought finer quality fabrics than those made in Italy. And as if infatuated with France and all things French, he got the idea of calling his son Francesco, that is, Frenchman. Though not as bad as occasionally portrayed, Pietro di Bernardone was every bit as tyrannical as parvenus often are, and his word was law within the four walls of his house. The baby would be called Francis. Naturally, he couldn't be baptized all over again, but Pica's objections were overruled, and she had no choice but to give in. So Francis, it would be an unusual name, a little bizarre, something like a surname. But then his mother had one herself. Still, no French boy would be burdened with the name English or Italian. Perhaps not, but a close inspection of the archives turned up 2 obscure Francescos, neither of them canonized. That was enough. Bernardone's anger shows that, like his wife, he believed in the crucial role a name could play in the destiny of the baptized child. This notion, which has largely faded today, can be traced all the way to Scripture, where a person's name was part of his being and identity. How curious that our banal passports and IDs are connected to the Hebraic Shem, but we go back further than we suspect. At all events, one could hear in Francis' vocation an echo of the vocation of St. John the Baptist, which was precisely what Bernardone would have none of. If, like Pica, the cloth merchant had been capable of seeing visions, his would have been altogether different. Already he saw his son behind the counter of his store, selling his fine fabrics to a select clientele and fattening the family's money bag. For Bernardone was notoriously greedy, and though he considered himself a good Christian, a zealous servant of Mammon. The house nowadays thought to be his could have passed for an aristocratic mansion, quite apart from all the land he owned in the surrounding countryside. But there was nothing of the feudal lord about Bernardone. Thanks to his great wealth, he belonged to the very important class of the big bourgeoisie. Pica, as far as we know, came from France. She was said to have made a pilgrimage to the Holy Land and possibly met her husband on the way back in Provence. That's as far as our information goes. On the other hand, if she was native of Umbria, then her name would come from her loquacity, taking Pica to mean magpie rather than Picard. But that runs counter our intuitive sense of what she was like. Anyhow, very early in life, the boy would have heard his father speaking French to him. Was it northern or southern French? Probably both, because if Pica set her sights high, Bernardone took the long view, thinking especially of the advantages this fluency would give Francis on future business trips across the Alps, in Provence and Champagne. Besides, the langue d'oïl was the language of the tourneys and the princely courts. The beauty of Gallic tongue was admired all over Europe, and was beginning to become an international language. Hence, from Bernardone's standpoint, speaking French would put Francis on the level of the nobility. For her part, Pica saw things quite differently. Like all mothers, she sang her favorite songs to the infant. She must have known the villanelle of the Provençal troubadour and bits and pieces of the chanson de geste, dinned into Picard ears by wandering minstrels. Then, of course, there would have been the spinning songs and the love poems sung by the trouvères in the misty woodlands, the forest of Ardennes and Flanders. One such song was Fair Duet. Fair Duet at the window sits, reads in a book, but her thoughts they stray. She thinks of her friend, Doom the beloved. He has gone off a-jousting far, far away, and I weep. Pica remains a fairly dim figure, but from what we know for certain about her, a lovable one. At a painful juncture in Francis' life, we shall see her giving proof of her courage and love. But what sort of upbringing did she give him? Presumably, she lavished on him all the care that a woman gives to a child she believes predestined to greatness. If her name really was Giovanna, and Pica was only a nickname, then she must have wanted a bond between herself and her son forged from their baptismal names. And when, as it chanced, Giovanna had her Christian name taken away, little Giovanni did too. Who was responsible for that? The father, as biographers have always claimed, or the lad's friends? Because of the French songs forever on his lips? It's of little consequence. His mother too would have sung him tender lullabies in French, and soon she would gently teach him his prayers in the peace and quiet of home. 2 other sons would be born there, but Giovanni would always be the favorite.